Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Channel Surfing. We're down here at the dock doing a bunch of electrical upgrades on an RT27 outboard. And I thought since I had all my tools out, I'd spend some time to go over what tools I use for all the electrical work that I do. None of the tools are super expensive, but there's a right tool for the right job that certainly makes the work a lot easier. So without any further ado, let's get started.
Close your eyes, hear the voice within, calling.
Alright, so we start with the small stuff, right? So when you buy connectors, right? Show these guys. These are small connectors. They've got they're ring connectors going in terminal. It's two different styles, right? You got heat shrink and you've got nylon, right? Nylon is only to be used interior, inside, never external, because it's you know, the only way to leverage nylon outside is you'd have to put heat shrink tubing on it to make it waterproof, which is an extra step, or you just buy the terminal that's already got heat shrink on it, and then that way you just crimp it and then you heat shrink it with a heat gun, and then you have a waterproof connection. Now the challenge with this is the crimper that you use. All right, so these connectors are made by Ancor, A-N-C-O-R. So I went to Ancor's website and bought the tools that they recommend for their stuff, right? So talk about just the crimpers for a sec. There's two styles of crimpers, right, that they have. So if we look, this one style here has got all these aggressive teeth and stuff on it. This does a good double crimp, and because of the aggressiveness, it will actually puncture through the it'll actually puncture through the plastic. This is why you only use the double crimp tool on nylon connectors, because they're not waterproof natively anyway, and you'd have to heat shrink on top of them to make them waterproof. So when you use the waterproof connectors, you want to use these because they're not going to puncture the waterproofness, right? They're just going to smush it so it doesn't puncture the outer plastic, and that way when you apply the heat to shrink this, you actually will get a waterproof connector, right? So one set of crimpers for heat shrink connectors, a different set of crimpers for doing the nylon non-waterproof connectors. Really important to differentiate between the two. Right tool, right job. You need something to cut the wire. So these actually are really sharp cutters. They will cut up to 2/0 cable. So this is an example of how thick 2/0 cable is. I put in comparison. Takes a little bit of effort, but for the most part it's pretty easy. Like that. Then once you have the connector, you have to strip the end of the cable. That's where you take this little tool. This is actually really cool. So the way this tool works is it's got a section on the bottom for doing small cable. You just stick the cable in there, rotate it, and pull, and it strips the wire. This will do 10 gauge and smaller. Right, but for the bigger stuff, we use this. And there's a little cutter blade in there, and there's a dial adjustment at the bottom that sets the depth of the blade. So you do a little trial and error initially to get the blade set correctly. Then you take this, as you leave about 1/4 of an inch on the outside, maybe a little less, and then let it bite, and you just rotate this around, and it cuts the outer sheath, right? You see the cut on it. Then I use these just to get a grip on the outside plastic. I actually don't go through it, and you just work it sideways. And there you go. And that way you don't lose any strands, and then you put your connector on and crimp it, which we're going to do here in just a minute. You need a hydraulic crimp tool. This is, I think it's a 10 or 14 ton. It's not very big, but big enough. So it's got these different dies that go with it. It's a set of dies, and there's a selection of them. Let's show this. So that's all the dies that go with there. So it comes with this little cheat sheet that shows, you know, it says if you're doing 2/0 cable, then you should use number 70. These are the number 70s, right? Well, and the crimper only goes up to 2/0 cable, by the way. Well, one of the problems I've found with this is that when it says use 70, that would be 2/0, which means there's no room to actually crimp it to squeeze it, because that the 270 dies together will equal the same diameter as what the 2/0 is. So if I'm going to crimp 2/0, I go one size smaller and I use a pair of 50s, and that'll crimp 2/0. If I was doing number 4, instead of 25s, I'd use a pair of 16s on the die. So let's show how this works. So I have cable to crimp, and I'm going to do a 1/0. This is 1/0, says that on the side. So for 1/0, I'm going to need a pair of 35s on the dies. I'm going to put my 35s into the die, tighten this so that I can move it. I've got my connector right here. So I need to strip the ends. I just leave a little bit, not that much off the end. Just like that. That's easy peasy. Then I take my connector, because I want this to slide in, right? So see how far in that's going to go? That's what you want. And you want to get all the little fine strands into there. Get a nice clean connection. That way it's nice and square. And then I put it into the crimper and we make it permanent. Now I will say, one of the advantages of doing your own cables, and I highly recommend if you have any kind of heavy battery cable stuff to do, don't buy the cables, make them yourself. Because what will happen is there's two ends of the cable. Don't assume that these connectors are going to be square to each other, right? You may have one cable this way and the other side may need to be 90 degrees out or 180 degrees out. It depends how the cable's getting routed, because these cables are really stiff and they're hard to twist, especially when they get really short. All right, so usually the first end doesn't matter, and then I go and I put it in the boat, I run it where I need it to go, I mark the other end, and then I have to figure out the orientation of the lug with how the cable's going to lay to know how I have to crimp the other side. So every cable I do, I have to do twice. Do the one end, install it, mark the other end, figure out the orientation of the connector, and then pull it back out and then crimp it. And then once it's crimped, then you got to do the heat shrink, which we'll do here in a second. And the other thing to keep in mind too is with these lugs, it matters what you're connecting them to, right? This is a 1/0 lug for a 1/0 cable, and it's got a 5/16 hole. They also make these with 1/4 inch. They make them with 3/8 inch holes in there. So what you're connecting it to matters. In this case, this guy's going to a battery, and the battery lugs are right here, battery screws, and they're a 5/16 screw. So that's why I'm using a 5/16. If I did 3/8, I'd have a little bit of wiggle and stuff in the play, which you really don't want. So I'll put it into the crimper. And I usually just take the slack out just till I get to the die, make sure it's centered, make sure it still sits square in, and then pressure it home. Alright, and you release the pressure, pull the connector out. Now you do the tug test. You pull on as hard as you can. A little dramatization here. Right, it should not come off. If it does, you did it wrong, redo it. Then once you do that, then you have to go ahead and put heat shrink tubing on it. So heat shrink tubing is for marine stuff and waterproof. All right, this is what it looks like. They make it in red and yellow, various colors. On the heat shrink tubing, you want 3-to-1 adhesive lined to make waterproof connections. The adhesive lined, it's a glue activated by heat. So when I stick this on the end and I run the heat gun against it, the glue is going to actually ooze out of both sides. That makes it a waterproof connection. And the 3-to-1 is important to get enough for it to actually shrink on and make a waterproof connection, because we don't want any salt water getting to the connectors. The wire is all tin copper. So when you cut it, the very end of the cable is actually going to have exposed copper. So we want to make that waterproof so air can't get to it, because if salt water and the air gets to the end of copper, it'll cause it to corrode. And that's what we don't want. So 3/4 inch heat shrink tubing is good for like 2/0 cable and smaller, down to about 8, which is what I'm using for most stuff here. You know, and I cut it to about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, just enough to make sure that it actually covers, you know, the full connector and enough of the insulation on the back. So let's show how this works. Take the heat gun. And this actually goes pretty quick. Kind of like ironing. You go all around it, get all the wrinkles and stuff out. And what I'm looking for, if you look really close, you can see that bead of glue all along the outside edge. That's the adhesive that's heat activated. That makes the entire connector waterproof, and you want to see that on both sides. Then you have a really good connector, but we're not done yet. Then you have to go ahead and label the end of the cable as well. So I picked up it's a Brady, what is this? It's a BMP 21 Plus. It takes these little cartridges. With nylon cloth cartridges at 3/4, I can come in here and I can say, I type in what I want it to say, right? So it says thruster. Then I can say it's a wire marker, and then it's going to say what size cable. And I'm going to say, well, it's either 10 gauge to 4/0. This is bigger than that. I'm working on 1/0. So I can do 3 gauge to 2/0 at 2.5 inch. That's what I want. And then I click print. And then it prints me a label like this. I take the label out, and then I just wrap it right around the cable just like that. That's how you do a battery connection. And it doesn't matter if it's 8 gauge or 4/0 or anything in the middle, they're all done the exact same. All it changes is just the size of the components. Pretty easy to do. Alright, so some other tips and tricks of what I do. Ranger Tug is really good on standardization. It's one of the things I really like. So all the boats, or I said the majority of all the screws that hold everything together on the boat are all square drive. Alright, so first thing I did was I went down to my local marine hardware store, Harbor Marine here in Everett, and right after I got the boat, and I went down and I bought a dozen screws that were all stainless, obviously, all square head, obviously, and I did buy some that have that kind of a head, some that have that kind of a head. I do some that are 1/2 inch long, 3/4 long, 1 inch long, size, you know, in screw sizes, number 6, number 8, number 10, number 12, just to have them on the boat. So I have a selection of screws, because when you're down the boat working, you have to get the correct screw. I'll give you a good example. So let's say I want to hook a wire, a zip tie holder to hold some cables to a bulkhead, and I'm going through starboard, and the starboard I have is 1/2 inch, right? Well, I don't want to do that, because that's bigger than 1/2 inch, and that's going to go through the starboard, and this is going to stick out on the other side of the bulkhead, which I'm not going to like, or it's going to poke into something that I don't want it to poke into. Could be an electrical cable, could be a tank, could be the hull, you don't know, right? So having a selection of screws, you have a small screw like this, it fits, and there you go, less than 1/2 inch. This is what I would then use, right? But you have to have that selection of screws to be able to size what it is you're looking for. So it's just easier just to go buy it, like I said, a dozen, and you know, number 6, number 8, number 10, 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1 inch, all square drive, various different sizes. It's just you have a selection to choose from when you're on the boat working, to pick the right size screw. Whenever you drill into fiberglass, if you're going to screw into fiberglass, always drill in reverse. It sounds counterintuitive, but if you do forward, you'll crack the gel coat easily. So you go in reverse until you get through the gel coat, and then you can switch it and go forward to go through the rest of the hole. And then the other thing I do is I want to countersink that. So, you know, I'll look at the size screw, and I'll say I need to pre-drill this so I don't crack the fiberglass. So I'll get a drill bit, and I'll drill the hole, start in reverse, right, get through the gel coat, then go forward to get through the rest of the hole I want. Then I'll take a much larger drill bit in reverse and go just on the hole again to chamfer the outside edge of that hole. And that helps, again, prevent it from cracking, the gel coat from cracking when you put the screw in there. That's a good tip. And we talk about type of connectors, so I'll highlight this. This is a style of connector not to use. The reason you don't want to use something like this is you see it's open at the end. So remember I told you when you cut the wires, that tin copper is going to expose copper on the end. Right, so that's why you would never use something that's open. All you ever want to use are connectors like this, right, that are closed at the very tip to make it entirely waterproof and protect that copper. The other thing is this connector, they use solder on the end of it to cover the copper. Not ideal. Generally you don't use solder at all on a boat because of the vibration and stuff. Solder will eventually crack, right? So here and again, another reason to use this style of connector only whenever you're doing marine electrical. I recommend getting a complete set of Robertson, which is your square drive. I picked up this. This was actually pretty useful because there's a handful of things on the boat that are a size 0. I don't think anything is a 00 that I've ran across, but I have ran across a 0 and a number 1 on the Robertsons, which are really small. Vast majority of everything is going to be a 2 or a 3 for the most part, but the 0 is hard to come by, and there's a couple of screws on the boat that actually do take a 0, and it's rare that you will find a number 0 in any kind of a kit that you might buy. So buying a set actually is a way to do that. One of my most favorite tools on the boat that I keep is this guy right here. This is a little ratchet, but this is a ratchet for screwdriver bits. This is hard to get at spaces, right? And there's several on the boat that I use this thing for. This never leaves the boat. So talking about colors on the boat, we've got red, black, and yellow. Why the yellow and not just red and black for DC wires, 12 volt, right? I mean, in automobiles and RVs, we've used red and black for 12 volt DC forever. What's the significance of yellow? Why do you see all the yellow cables? So here it is when you put AC 120 volt AC systems on the boat, and you also have 12 volt DC systems, in AC wiring, it's 3 wires. There's the black, which is the hot, there's the white, which is the neutral, and the green, which is the ground, which is your safety circuit, effectively, right? Your backup to your neutral in case it was to fail. So being alternating current, right, your black is hot. In 12 volt DC, we used to use black as the negative and red as the positive. Now, I don't know what would happen, I've never done it, if I took the AC hot wire that's black and I connected it to a 12 volt negative, right, to the battery, which would be black. But I have to assume nothing good would come from that. Right, so to differentiate the colors to make sure that doesn't happen, ABYC, they switched to yellow to be the alternative for negative. All right, whenever you have AC on the systems. And you know, all of Ranger tugs, I'll have inverters and stuff, so they're all running 120 volt AC. All the boats have microwaves and stuff in them. So your AC wire is going to be your black, white, and your green, you know, your hot, neutral, and your ground. And then all of the DC wiring is going to be red and yellow, yellow being the 12 volt negative, just to differentiate the two colors. So it's really important, you know, that the shrink, you know, heat shrink tubing also matches. You know, colors are really important in electrical. You know, if I put, yeah, if you just mix colors up, it gets confusing to people. There are times when you have to encase a wire in black split loom. I'll show you what that looks like. So here's an example. So this is actually a jumper wire used to go between the two batteries, right? So it's all crimped, heat shrinked, and then because it's an unfused cable, you have to put black split loom on it, right? And because it's just a jumper cable going between two batteries, and it's not fused, and because it's not fused, then you do the black split loom to act as an additional level of protection from the cable like vibrating and wearing through and causing a short. But now it makes it look like a black cable, so all the cables are black. How do you tell them apart? Then you use electrical tape, right? So you would mark the ends, you know, being red, so I know this is a red cable. If this was negative, the ends would be would have yellow electrical tape wrapped around the ends to mark it as a negative if we did that. So black split loom is really important. Like I said, for any cable that's in an area that's prone, that you know is going to have a lot of vibration, you would do it. Or if you knew the cable was unfused, then you would always do it. As far as other tools I keep in the boat, I always keep the DeWalt 12 volt drill, not the 20 or anything. I just want something small, lightweight, easy to manage. So at 2 speeds, you know, number 1 or 2, so 2 for drilling, 1 for screwing. Real easy to get in and do a lot of work on the boat quick with this. And here and again, even as small as it is, it still doesn't fit in all places. And then again, that's what the Craftsman, that's what the Craftsman ratchet is for, is in those really tight spaces. So one other thing I want to mention too, that's pretty important too, is when you have a stud that you're going to mount your battery connectors on, you can stack connectors on a single stud. Don't do more than 4. And when you stack them, it also matters, think of it as a pyramid. You want the biggest on the bottom and the smallest on the top. So like the example I have here, all right, if I was to use, say I had these, let's say I had these 3 connectors that I wanted to go ahead and do, right? So the biggest one is going to go on the bottom. The second biggest one would go on the top, and then the last biggest one would go at the very top of it, right? And if you have washers involved, right, this is a really big problem. The washers then would go on the very top to act as a mechanical to seat everything and hold it together. You have to think of the current flowing through it, right? If you did this the other direction, like let's say I put the small one on first, then I went ahead and I did the big one this way, then I put a washer in here, and then I put the other one. So what's going to happen here is stainless steel washers actually are fantastic resistors, and they're horrible at conducting electricity. So that stainless steel washer in between the lugs is going to get hot and possibly cause an issue we don't want on the boat. All right, the bottom one being the smallest is going to pass all the current from the big connector is going to go through that small connector. That's going to get hot too. This is an accident waiting to happen. Don't ever do this, right? Be very, very meticulous when you do your connectors. Make sure you always stack them. Biggest on the bottom first, then second biggest, and then last biggest, and never do more than 4. And make sure that the washers and stuff are never in the flow path of the electricity. You want it on the outside, squeezing it together to hold everything together, but to not actually pass any current. Really important to make sure that you do that. And with that, if you have any other suggestions for tools that I should look at or whatever, please leave them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed watching this video, click the screen to watch another.